When I teach sociology of violence, I make a point to show the students photos and videos of real world violence. And I tell them, the point of this is not to be voyeuristic and to shock you for shocking you's sake. We're not doing faces of death videos or celebrity autopsy or anything like that. But I do want them to get a grasp of the reality because for many people, their main exposure to violence is in action movies where everything's very choreographed and stylized and not as ugly and unfair as real world violence often is. And when I talk about historical violence, I think photos and videos, if they're available, are good for trying to bring the past home to people because the past can often seem like something from a storybook when you just read a dry description of it in a text. Seeing the images makes it seem more real. I once saw a blogger refer to the feeling as reverse science fiction when you see one of those old colorized and speed corrected videos from the early 20th century of a world that's now bygone, but in that video looks just as real as the world you walk through. Well, in a couple of my classes, I have a photo I like to show. And this photo features two young black men hanging from a tree. Their clothes are torn and they're bloodied, and they've obviously been beaten before being hanged to death. They're the victims of a lynching in Marion, Indiana in the year 1930. The two hanged men were accused of murdering a white factory worker who was killed the night before, and they're also accused of raping his girlfriend who was with him at the time of the murder. A teenage associate of theirs had also been accused, but the mob spared him when a couple of prominent white people spoke up in support. That teenager, who went on to become a civil rights activist and anti-lynching activist, later said that the hanged men did in fact commit the murder, though it appears that the rape charge was fabricated as something to make sure they got the worst punishment possible, which wasn't necessarily the punishment that a court was going to mete out. Because as it was, the angry mob seized the accused men from jail, brutalized them, and hanged them in the courthouse square in front of a crowd of 5,000 people. One member of that crowd was a photographer who took the photo. The photograph became somewhat famous. Supposedly, at one point, it was even sold as a postcard, though I can't imagine who'd want to get that in the mail. The photo inspired a poet named Abel Meeropol to write a poem about lynching called Strange Fruit, which later became a song by Billie Holiday. But to me, the most fascinating thing about the photo isn't the murdered men, it's the crowd standing behind them. It's fascinating because the people in this crowd look so normal, and not even just normal, respectable. I think a lot of people, my younger self included, might expect the crowd at a lynching to be some sort of stereotypical dirty rednecks or maybe guys in Ku Klux Klan regalia or some other sort of visibly disreputable character. Instead, in the foreground of this image, we see guys in collared white shirts, guys with ties. One is holding hands with his wife. We see a middle-aged woman with nice hair, a little old lady. You could swap out the background and convince people that this photo was taken at a church social or a town hall or a holiday in the park. And you look at it and you realize that some of the people in this mob could be people you know. Now, granted, who knows if any of these individuals in the photo actually took part in the killing and who just showed up later to gawk. But the image serves as a reminder to me and for my students that collective violence can draw in a cross-section of the community, and the people involved in these incidents aren't some separate species. They are people like us. And that's something that might be harder to keep in mind when we're talking about something like the topic of our last couple of podcasts, settlers and Indians along the frontiers in the early American colonies. This is a world that's much more distant from us. But today, we're going to address a pattern of violence that is a bit closer to home, one that persisted well into the age of photography and even into the age of cars and planes and radios. Today, we're going to talk about justice at the hands of Judge Lynch. So, let's start by clarifying what we mean by lynching. We addressed this in the first episode, but if you missed that or if you don't recall, historian and sociologist Roberta Senechal de la Roche has a typology of collective violence. And while it doesn't cover all the things we'll talk about in this series, it is a pretty good start. She distinguishes lynching, rioting, and vigilantism by their degree of organization and also by how the targets of the violence are chosen. So she defines lynching and rioting as violence that is carried out by groups with low organization. So instead of a formal group with a chain of command and a clear membership that persists over months or years, these kinds of violence are inflicted by a temporary mob that comes together, carries out the violence, and then disbands. And what makes a lynch mob different from a mob of rioters is that the lynchers are targeting people based on individual liability. That is, they're punishing one or a few people for some criminal or deviant act that they're personally accused of committing. Now, people in the US these days tend to think of lynching in connection with the oppression of Black people in the South during the Jim Crow era. The association is so strong that some people here treat the term lynching as synonymous with the killing of Black people or with anti-Black racism. But historically, the word always referred more broadly to some sort of violent mob justice, especially execution for some alleged crime. And that's still the way that people in other parts of the world use the term today. And if you think lynching is just something of the past or just something peculiar to American history, I suggest searching some news sites online for recent lynching stories in India or Uganda or Nigeria, and you'll see that angry mobs still beat and kill people over allegations of theft or rape or blasphemy or whatever else is a major moral concern in that locale. I've also seen people use the term lynching as synonymous with death by hanging, but lynch mobs, as we're calling them here, use a variety of methods against their victims, including beating, shooting, or burning them to death. In fact, Senechal de la Roche doesn't even define lynching as lethal violence, so we might also count cases where mobs beat or mutilate a person without killing them as lynchings, or at least as lesser degrees of the same basic pattern. And I bring that up because one pattern we're going to see in mob justice, and again in rioting and again in vigilantism, is that in America's earliest days, it tended to be relatively mild. Now, we've covered some big spasms of violence on this podcast, some of it genocidal, that happened along the frontiers of the English colonies. But for the most part, a few big rebellions aside, the collective violence within the colonies was not very severe. You see mobs punishing people with rough treatment that is more focused on humiliation than causing severe injury or death. And one of these forms of mob justice that you find in colonial America is something called the chivalry. Now, that's how you pronounce it, I'm told, chivalry. If you see it spelled, if you're a speaker of American English, it looks like it's supposed to be pronounced charavari. Well, however you pronounce it, it is a form of communal punishment that was found in England and Europe in small towns and villages going back to pre-colonial times. In this form of folk punishment, the crowd would forcibly parade an offending person through the town while making loud cacophonous music and banging on pots and pans. This mock parade was designed to shame and humiliate some member of the community who had gone too far or was a repeat offender or in some other way offended the collective conscience. Sometimes these were almost purely nonviolent. The crowd just carried an effigy of the offender around and abused that rather than the person himself or herself. But in other cases, they had at least mild violence. The offender is dragged forcibly from home or work and paraded around while being pelted with rotten fruit or animal dung or maybe even something harder like a rock. And they might get dunked in water or tied to a pole or a rail and carried around the town. So these are slightly violent, though the main punishment is still the humiliation the offender feels and being on the outside of the community's good graces. We might say that the more violent cases of this do match our definition of lynching, but that they are at most on the mildest extreme of that phenomenon. And you see the chivalry tradition in colonial America. Notably, and this is a pattern we'll come back to, you see it a lot out on the frontiers, which tend to have an absence of courts and police, leaving only informal community sanctions in their place. Also notable is that these frontier chivalries actually tend to be milder than the Old English or French ones, and usually end with some sort of rituals of social repair or reintegration designed to bring the offender back into the community. Incidentally, some people speculate that the chivalry might be the origin of some American wedding rituals, like tying cans to the newlyweds' car or playing pranks on them on their wedding night. Though how you get from communal punishment to that, I don't quite know. Another kind of mob punishment that's usually non lethal is tarring and feathering. This too is an old tradition. It goes back to at least the Middle Ages in England. For instance, in the year 1189, King Richard I ordered that any crusaders found guilty of theft should have their heads shaved and be covered in boiling pitch and then covered in feathers. And later on in the year 1623, a bishop ordered the tarring and feathering of a group of friars and nuns as punishment for getting drunk. And there's also accounts of an angry mob of citizens who tarred and feathered an official who was arresting someone over a debt. Now, while tarring and feathering has deep roots in England, there aren't any recorded cases of it in the American colonies prior to the mid-1700s. Then in 1766, there's the case of a ship's captain in New York who orders the tarring and feathering of a prostitute who was trying to sneak onto his ship. And from this point on, once tarring and feathering has been introduced to the American colonies, the practice really takes off in them, to the point where people in Britain will come to view this as a distinctively American form of violence, a practice of those volatile, savage colonials. And one thing that encourages this impression is that tarring and feathering quickly becomes associated with the patriot cause, something used to punish people who were deemed guilty of enforcing or collaborating with unpopular British policies. For example, when the practice takes off in Virginia in the 1860s, the targets are usually customs officials enforcing a new and unpopular tax on imported goods, or else people accused of being informants who were tipping off these officials about shipments that people are trying to bring in under the radar. To quote from an article by historian Benjamin H. Irvin, quote, "In June 1768, the populace of Salem became enraged by a person who gave information of a vessel that arrived there with molasses. To punish the informant, the crowd stripped him, then wrapped him in a tarred sheet and rolled him in feathers. Having done this, they carried him about the streets in a cart and then banished him from the town for 6 weeks. Before summer's end, Salem residents had feathered another informant and a low-level customs official. News of these events quickly spread along the Atlantic seaboard, and the tar and feathers trend caught on. By March 1770, at least a dozen incidents of tar and feathers had taken place in towns as far away as Newburyport, Gloucester, Boston, Marlborough, New Haven, New York, and Philadelphia." End quote. Some of the attacks might deviate from our definition of lynching in that they're directed or carried out by a standing patriot organization like a local militia or a group going by the name of Sons of Liberty, but others do appear to be more spontaneous mob actions. Things calmed down a little in the early 1770s, but then as the tensions between the colonies and the crown heats up, tarring and feathering gets even more common. In 1774, for instance, one man is tarred and feathered for allegedly informing on someone who took part in the Boston Tea Party. Now, in Patriot strongholds, people might be tarred and feathered just for speaking against the Patriot cause. For instance, in New York in 1775, a young man made the mistake of criticizing the Continental Congress to a group of young women who had gathered for a quilting bee. When the women got fed up with this unpatriotic talk, they seized him, and not having any tar and feathers handy, they covered him in molasses instead and some downy plants growing in the field. Historian Benjamin Irvin writes, "During the critical summer of 1775, several individuals were tarred and feathered for calling into question the authority of the Continental Congress and its local committees. In Charleston, South Carolina, two men were outfitted in complete suits of tar and feathers for toasting damnation to the committee in their proceedings, and a soldier at the town's Fort Johnson was tarred for wantonly cursing and abusing America and all her committeemen. Similarly, in York, Pennsylvania, the Committee of Safety tarred a Tory for insulting Congress and its measures, while in Bladenburg, Maryland, a great number of men loaded with arms attempted to tar and feather George Monroe for espousing strange sentiments. Before the end of the year, tar and feathers was doled out for comparable speech crimes in New York, Virginia, Georgia, and New Jersey. End quote. As people got more accustomed to the practice, sometimes they tarred and feathered for alleged crimes unconnected to patriotism. For example, a large mob of nearly 1,000 people tarred and feathered four men accused of stealing from a smallpox hospital. In most cases, the mobs used pine tar, a substance that was commonly used for sealing and waterproofing in those days. Sometimes the offender was lucky enough that they'd put the tar on over his clothing. Sometimes they stripped him naked first and applied it to the skin with rollers. Other times they just dunked him in a barrel of the stuff. Now, much like the chivalry, the main object was usually more humiliation and intimidation than serious injury. So in most cases, the tar wasn't heated first, and so the typical victim was only going to come away with skin irritation from scrubbing the tar off and probably losing some body hair with it. But there was variation in how severe the crowd would be. In one case in Boston in 1774, the crowd carted a victim around for several hours on a January day. And thinking about the temperatures in Boston on January, probably aren't surprised to learn he had severe frostbite after this that caused strips of his skin to come off with the tar. In other Boston cases, after the mob added feathers on top of the tar, they set fire to the feathers, burning the victim's skin. And in a few cases, the mob would, after tarring and feathering the victim, severely beat him as well. And in at least one case, this led to a fatality. When the Revolutionary War broke out in 1776, violence between patriots and loyalists became more organized and more severe, with the consequence that tarring and feathering by impromptu mobs dropped off steeply. But the practice didn't completely die out during the war and was resurrected after. You still had tarrings and featherings in New Jersey and Virginia in the 1780s. In 1794, a huge mob in Baltimore tarred and feathered an English ship's captain for having the temerity to fly an American flag upside down. And tarring and feathering was part of the repertoire of mob violence in the South and Appalachia throughout the early 1800s. And you even get some cases of tarring and feathering cropping up much later in the 20th century. If you go Google the term, you'll probably find a photo of a German-American farmer whose neighbors tarred and feathered him during World War I for not supporting a war bond drive. And you can also find news stories and photos from as recently as the 1950s about Jehovah's Witnesses being tarred and feathered by crowds who objected to them proselytizing in their neighborhoods. Here again, most of us nowadays associate the term lynching with lethal violence, and execution by mobs doesn't really become common until well after the Revolutionary War. And this is also when the term lynching itself comes into usage. There's a couple of suggested origins for the term, but the most common, it seems, is that it comes from the actions of Virginian Charles Lynch during the Revolutionary War. Perhaps it's ironic, since Lynch himself was a Quaker and Quakers believe in pacifism, though Lynch was a Virginia Quaker, and maybe in colonial times they were a bit of a different breed than the Pennsylvania ones. Well, Charles Lynch is, during the Revolutionary War, in charge of a court in Virginia that imprisons loyalists. And keep in mind that only about a third of colonists were strongly in the Patriot camp during this conflict, with a third being loyalist and another third probably just worried about getting the harvest in time so their kids wouldn't starve. So with all of these people of questionable loyalty in the populace, policing them was a major problem for the Patriot cause. And Charles Lynch was detaining people without trial despite having no formal authority to do so. After the war was over, a lot of these people turned around and filed legal complaints against him for violating what would have been their rights under both the old and new regimes, leading Lynch to ask the U.S. government to exonerate him based on it being a necessary wartime expedient to have locked these people up without trial. he gets what he asked for, and people start referring to Lynch's law as a law allowing extrajudicial punishment under some circumstances. And eventually that gets shortened to Lynch law, coming to mean more generally any punishment without trial. And eventually that turns into a verb. To get lynched means to get punished without due process. Only since in these early days, extra legal punishments are still mostly non lethal, people initially associate the term lynching specifically with beating, whipping, or tarring and feathering. I've even seen quotes from one old newspaper claiming that an act of fatal mob violence was not a mere lynching, but an execution. As mob violence grows more lethal in the early 1800s, the connotations of this term will change and will become closer to the modern connotation. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the earliest lethal lynching in American history is. I know at least one or two of those tarrings and featherings in the 1770s was fatal, with the target being beaten to death as part of the punishment. So perhaps one of those counts as our earliest recorded one. But it seems generally like lethal lynching was becoming common and was established by the 1830s. And this is going to be something of a theme in this series, since organized vigilantism and urban rioting also become more lethal and more severe around the same time period in the 1820s and 1830s. One of these 1830s cases of lethal lynching happens in Missouri, and the victim is a black freeman named McIntosh. He's from Pittsburgh. The year is 1836, and one thing I like to do when I try to orient myself to a time period is I think about what people of various ages in that time period would have lived through, to try to get a sense of what they've experienced or how they would view their own time in relations to others. So 1836, there's probably still a few old codgers around who remember when Pittsburgh wasn't much more than Fort Pitt, an outpost beyond the frontier of regular British settlement under siege during Pontiac's War. And there are certainly still some veterans of the Revolutionary War hanging around, and even more people who remember living in a British colony when they were little. But our man McIntosh is not one of them. He's only 26. He was born well into this century. He's never lived in Pennsylvania colony. He's always lived in the United States of America. And in any case, he's not lynched in the place he's from, but in a common pattern we'll see, he's lynched in a place he recently arrived in, St. Louis, Missouri. How does he come to be in St. Louis, Missouri? Well, McIntosh is working on a steamboat, and the boat had just set into St. Louis that very day. Another thing I try to do with these historical accounts sometimes to make them more real to myself if no one else is I try to think about the texture involved. So the account tells me this lynching happens in late April. Well, you know what the weather in late April is like. So picture spring in bloom. Imagine it's a warm day maybe, and everyone involved in this is smelling flowers in the air. Well, some flowers. Probably also lots of horse manure and smoke from cooking fires and the occasional whiff of an outhouse because no one has plumbing yet. So McIntosh's ship arrives in St. Louis. The incident starts when two police officers come to the dock chasing other sailors for some infraction. Some versions of what happened next says that McIntosh just refuses to help the police capture these two fleeing sailors. Another version says that he actively helps these fleeing sailors escape. Either way, the cops turn on him and he gets arrested for interfering in an arrest. McIntosh then asks the cops how long he'll serve in prison for this offense, and one of the officers tells him 5 years. At which point, I guess he decides to go for broke because he pulls out a knife and stabs them both. One is killed, one is badly injured. McIntosh then runs down the street and hides in an outhouse. I told you there would be the smell of outhouses involved. While he's hiding in the outhouse, the crowd searching for him discovers him, seizes him, and takes him to jail. But the crowd is not satisfied with the law, and they quickly break him back out of that jail, take him to the edge of town, and chain him to a locust tree. Side note here, they say the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. Well, much like foreign countries in our own time, the big differences might be the first thing you notice. We tend not to execute people chained to trees nowadays. But you also start to notice the little differences, like that conversation in the car in Pulp Fiction. It's the little things that stand out sometimes. So you read a ton of these lynching accounts from the 19th century. People are constantly being chained to trees to be shot or burned, or they're being hanged to death from trees. And one weird little detail I've noticed is that they always tell you what kind of tree it was. I think it just stands out because I don't imagine a modern news report about a mob killing would bother to specify that. They would just say, oh, the person was chained to a tree or hanged from a tree. But of course, the 19th century sources always specify it was an oak tree, a locust tree, a black walnut, a sycamore, probably indicating the way in which the people of this century were more involved with trees and their properties than we will ever be, much more closer to the wild world. In any case, Macintosh is chained to this locust tree and he's burned to death. And this grisly detail seems as good a place as any to end this free preview. If you would like to listen to the full 2.5 hours of this podcast, which takes us all the way up into the last big lynchings of the 1930s and considers reasons that lynching first rose and then declined, please become a paid subscriber to Bullfish Hole on Substack. Thank you very much.